Well, good afternoon and welcome to our Wednesday webinar. And thank you for joining us, whether you're watching us live or whether you're seeing this as a recording later on. My name is Tim Ferguson. I'm part of the ministries team at Baptist Together. And while we're not making any promises, we do still hope to host a webinar at 1 o'clock every Wednesday for the time being, as we continue to tackle topics in response to the current situation we all find ourselves in. The details of these webinars will be posted on the Baptist Together website alongside the recordings of the previous webinars. What I can tell you is that next week we're going to hear from Jane Day. So she's going to be addressing the question, is there a better time to try contemplation? And you may well think, yes, there is, but Jane's going to help us to explore how our devotional life could or even should change during lockdown. So that's at 1 p.m. Next Wednesday, that's the 29th of April. And also the following week, on the 6th of May, we're going to be finding out about a new prayer resource called Gathering the Crumbs, which is written by Baptist women, but is suitable for all. And we'll give you more details of that next week. Today, our topic is leadership in a time of crisis. So we're going to consider what our leadership priorities should be at this strange time, when everything's up in the air, and this is for an uncertain period of time. How do we lead churches and communities in ways that are simple and sustainable? How can we be authentic to the particular calling God has given us, whilst recognizing our pattern of leadership may have to develop? So I'm very pleased today to be joined by Reverend Prof Philip McCormack, Principal of Spurgeon's College, and Reverend Dr. Clive Burnard, Regional Minister for Yorkshire Baptist Association. Philip is himself, of course, leading an organisation of 40 staff and hundreds of students through this season, and he's also written extensively on ethics, and particularly how they drive our approach to leadership. And Clive has particular responsibility in the Yorkshire Baptist Association for transformational mission. And his doctoral studies were in transformational servant leadership. So Clive and Philip, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to begin with Philip in a moment, but first of all, can I just encourage those of you taking part to add your comments and questions to the stream that's on the right of your screen throughout the webinar. And the questions that appear there, we will try to address a little bit later on as we go through. So, Philip, do please lead us into this time of discussion. I don't know if I just get the right. There we go. Just click on the right thing. So, Philip, over to you.
Thanks, Tim. And thank you for the opportunity to take part in this webinar today. The theme that I have is resilience and leadership. The background to this was a number of years ago, I was asked by a group of people if I would do a series of talks or give a series of talks on building resilience. And it's something that I find very helpful personally. And I did a series of talks which I had quite a large number of non-saved and non-Christian people coming along to listen to. It was in a military context, but it was attended by many civilians. When I was doing the research for it, one of the things that struck me about it was the resources that are available online. And many of the commentators who speak on this subject about resilience would comment on how in modern life, many live very closely with social media. And when you look at some people's lives on social media, you would be tempted to think that every time they go out, the sun is shining. The children are always immaculately presented and dressed, and everything they do has that glitz of Hollywood around it, which can often make people feel as though somehow their life is inferior, especially if, like ordinary people, you find yourself engaged with the ups and downs of ordinary life. And resilience is that, and the definition for resilience is along these lines. Resilience is that ineffable quality that allows some people to be knocked down by life and come back stronger than ever, rather than letting failure overcome them. and drain their resolve, they find a way to rise from the ashes. And in one of the psychology books that I looked at in preparing this series of lectures, I came across this quote: "Psychologists have identified some of the factors that make someone resilient. Among them, a positive attitude, optimism, the ability to regulate emotions, and the ability to see failure as a form of helpful feedback. Even after misfortune, resilient people are blessed with such an outlook that they are able to change course and soldier on." Now, one of the great examples of resilience in leadership would be the wartime leader Winston Churchill. And Churchill had an amazing ability to turn a very fine turn of phrase. And one of my favorite Churchill phrases is, "A pessimist sees a difficulty in every opportunity. An optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty." Now, when you look at the history of Churchill and look at his political life, you can see that he faced tremendous amounts of difficulty and periods of what would be considered political failure. And one of the other quotes I want to share with you about resilience is this: "Success is not final. Fatal is not failure. It is the courage to continue that counts." I've actually largely memorized this quote because when you lead, regardless of the situation you find yourself in, the leader does not always find themselves in a perfect situation with everything going perfectly and it's a level playing field and the sun is shining and it's a gentle breeze. Often circumstances of life can place a leader in real difficulty. And I've learned in my own experience as a leader that whatever success we may have by the grace of God, it's not final. God has a further plan for us, and neither is fatal failure. It's the courage to continue that really counts. And something that Churchill learned from personal experience was success, he found, is going from failure to failure without a loss of enthusiasm. I must confess, I don't know how to do that, perhaps to the extent that he did, but I recognize what he says, that success is going from failure to failure without a loss of enthusiasm. So this talk draws on two distinct areas of thought: virtue ethics, and a principle that I've embraced for a long time is that we are what we repeatedly do. And there is this theme that emerges. It's a causality. These things are integrated and linked together. Our thoughts can become actions, our actions become habits, our habits then become ingrained as behaviours, and those behaviours become known as character traits. And I've been heavily influenced in my own academic thinking and pastoral thinking and leadership role by the insights to how the human mind works in neuroplasticity and neuroscience. I've long believed that virtue ethics and discipleship are consistent and compatible. Discipleship is an ongoing process. We never get to a point in our Christian faith where we can say, right, I've finished learning, I've reached the point of perfection. So in our work with Christ, we can't get any more perfect. At the risk of oversimplification, virtue ethics is that practice of doing small things consistently well, understanding that we can always keep on going, developing and growing. If you would have went to and asked the Greek philosopher Aristotle how to be a good carpenter, I have no doubt that he would have replied something along these lines: do woodwork until you become a good carpenter. Discipleship, likewise, is not a theory, it's a way of being. The disciple, the methetes, is somebody who learns from a master and then puts into practice what they have learned from the master on a daily, ongoing basis. And so one of the themes that have been deeply influential in my own experience as a leader is this phrase that is taken from the American philosopher Will Durant: we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not a habit. It's not an act, but a habit. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act. It is a habit. Excellence isn't an amazing one-off brilliance. If you watched a very skilled potter working at their wheel, and you see a beautiful vase rise elegantly, without real effort. It might look as if the potter has been blessed with some divinely gifted skill, and maybe they have. But what my experience has been working with skilled tradespeople is that what you see as a simple act is the product of thousands of hours of practice and habituation. It is the product of doing small things consistently well, doing small things repeatedly well and again and again and again, so that our thoughts then get manifested in actions, and repeated actions then become habits. Our behaviours are shaped by the habits that we develop, and the character that we manifest to others is often seen in the behavioural traits that people see. We are what we repeatedly do. I think one of the most famous modern examples of this was what's described as the miracle on the Hudson with US Airways Flight 1549 that took off out of LaGuardia Airport on the 15th of January. A few minutes into the flight, the airplane was struck by a flock of Canadian wild geese, and it lost both engines. And the captain on board was Captain Sully Sullenberger, very experienced pilot. And he quickly made the calculation that he couldn't return back to the airport and he couldn't divert to a local airport. And he took the decision to land on the Hudson River. And you can actually still see video footage of the airplane landing perfectly on the Hudson River. And it is so amazing that it's described as the miracle on the Hudson River. Well, when he was interviewed a few months after this by an American TV anchor, he said this: one way of looking at this might be that for 42 years, I've been making small, regular deposits in a bank of experience and education and training. And on the 15th of January, the balance was sufficient so that I could make a very large withdrawal. Everything that went into making the miracle on the Hudson River the miracle that it was actually the result of the multitude of small things that he had done consistently well in his life on a day-by-day basis, in the myriad of things that went to shape the nature of his day-by-day life. So what seemed to be an amazing act of brilliance, and it was actually the product of dozens of years of experience of doing small things consistently well. And this is where neuroplasticity is really important. What scientists have discovered is that our brain is incredibly plastic in the terms that we have the ability to learn new skills and new behaviours right throughout our lives. The old adage that you can't teach a dog new tricks is simply wrong when it comes to the human brain. It takes about a week for the brain to start to develop new neurons to accommodate the new practices that we decide to incorporate in our daily lives. I would recommend to anyone listening to this webinar that you watch a TED Talk by Dr. Laura Boyd. It's entitled, "After Watching This, Your Brain Will Not Be the Same." And I know Mike will probably put up the link for you to watch it. And the reason why she entitled the video, "After Watching This, Your Brain Will Not Be the Same," is simply this: our brain is in a continual state of change. What we do every day, the brain accommodates by restructuring itself to be able to enable us to have the habits that we want to incorporate in our lives. And this is what makes virtue ethics so significant. One of the ways in which we can build resilience into our lives is not by somehow becoming amazingly brilliant, though I'm sure many listening to this are. And I'm not being facetious, I'm being genuine. I never cease to be amazed at the gift that God has called into his service. But actually, one of the secrets to building resilience as a leader is the habit of doing small things consistently well, day after day after day, so that in a crisis, we actually inhabit and live out and act out the good habits that we have decided before to incorporate into our lives. And the amazing thing about virtue ethics and the amazing thing about neuroplasticity is that it doesn't take years to do this. If you decide to ingrain a new habit into your life over the next 7 days, and someone was to take a thermal imaging scan of your brain, in 7 days' time, your brain will have slightly altered its configuration to accommodate whatever new habit you have decided to incorporate. Whatever you decide to do as a result of this webinar today, your brain will reconfigure itself to incorporate into how you act and how you behave. We are what we repeatedly do. Small things consistently well ingrains good habits in our lives, and in a time of crisis, it's those habits that continue to shape behaviour and that reveal itself in the character traits that we demonstrate to others. And Clive will take this now on and look about how that can be transformational in our leadership.
Philip, thank you. So, Clive, I'll hand over to you. Just you might want to start to apply some of that thinking about resilience in leadership, therefore, to our current situation a little bit more.
Well, the first thing I'd want to do is thank you, Tim, for this privilege, and thank Philip. I can feel the neuroplasticity of my brain changing even as we speak. So I'm grateful for that. I'd like to take a slightly different tack, but it absolutely meshes with what Philip's saying. We're good friends, and I'm grateful for that encouragement to continue being transformed by Jesus myself. The tack I'd like to take is by speaking about a piece of artwork to begin with. Some of you will have heard of a piece of art called Salvator Mundi, which means the saviour of the world. It was painted, and there was some dispute historically about who did that back in about 1500. And it was sold in 1958 in London at Sotheby's for £45. I just had to check my figures there, because it was sold a few years ago, 2017, at Christie's in New York for $450.3 million. What's the point I want to make? Well, it's not that you shouldn't sell your artwork at Sotheby's London. You should sell it at Christie's New York. It's that the difference happened when in 2011, the piece of art, Salvator Mundi, Saviour of the World, was attributed officially to its great master, Leonardo da Vinci, rather than one of his apprentices. Now, let me read a verse of scripture. I'm going to read from the New Living Translation for Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 10, which says this: "For we," you and I, Paul, who's writing to Christians in Ephesus in Turkey, as we know it now, "For we are God's masterpiece. He has created us anew in Christ Jesus so that we can do the good things," the good works, it says in the NIV, the New International Version, "so that we can do the good things he planned for us long ago." Ephesians 2, verse 10 from the New Living Translation. The Greek word there, which in the NIV is workmanship in Christ Jesus, is better translated, I believe, in the NLT, masterpiece. And let me say this, I hope this is at least something positive you're going to hear from Philip and I today. Everybody out there, as Philip referred to his surprise at the giftedness of those who are called, is a masterpiece. God's word says it. God doesn't make junk. And I guess I've already been in touch with about 7 pastors today as a regional minister. I'll be mentoring in this kind of way a woman minister later this afternoon. All masterpieces. They're all very different. I want to let you know that in this time of crisis, some people feel a sense of failure. Remember what Philip shared about Churchill's view of that. We keep going from one failure to another with enthusiasm until we reach the success. There are people who, however, nevertheless, because they're not great at doing online services, they're not great perhaps with the technology, or that's just not their thing, they're feeling, by comparison with others, a sense of failure. They see other ministers, other women and men as the heroines and the heroes of this time of pandemic. And we're just being too hard on ourselves if we say that. This is not about, in a time of crisis, beating ourselves up for not being what we are. It's about leaning into those things that God has designed us for, built into us, those things he planned in advance for us to do. So, for instance, those who are not particularly good at the technology and the live services, you may well have others, because we're in team, in your congregation who are. And that might be a good thing for your church. But it might make such a difference as you pick up the phone, because your people know that you love them, and you have a pastoral phone call. There's something that we can do, and we can even reflect deeply on how God might be wanting to change us, and I should say our churches, in this time of crisis. I've been thinking through the Pastoral Epistles, particularly where Paul writes to Timothy in 1 and 2 Timothy, and he has to remind Timothy, a young man who he reminds not to let others look down upon him because he's young. We always have this understanding that Timothy's perhaps a bit timid. Paul tells him in 2 Timothy 1:6, "For this reason I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands." And if I put alongside that 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 14, Paul has already said to Timothy, don't neglect your gift, not the gift of others. Don't neglect your gift, which was given you through a prophetic message when the body of elders laid their hands upon you. It seems almost certain that this laying on of hands and this mention of the gift that has been given through the laying on of hands from both 1 and 2 Timothy is probably Timothy's moment of that human recognition of God's call upon his life, what we might call ordination, commissioning, whatever language you prefer. And Paul is the one who has been apprenticing Timothy. I hope in these days that we are able to continue to encourage others and set an example for them in a time of crisis. Tim's already mentioned my doctoral research about transformational servant leaders. I won't give you, don't worry, the 90,000 word version, but in a couple of sentences, Jesus was the supreme servant, no argument. But what's often overlooked is that Jesus was the supreme visionary, a white-hot visionary with a vision of the kingdom of God. And yet what he did, what he invested a lot of his time doing, others, was developing others, was encouraging others, just as Paul did with Timothy. Paul reminded Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 5 to keep his head in all situations. He'd say that, I'm sure, to us in this time of pandemic. Endure hardship. And also, though it wasn't probably Timothy's gift, he told Timothy to do the work of an evangelist and discharge all the duties of his ministry, not someone else's. So for leadership in a time of crisis, I just want to encourage myself and all of you out there, you women and men called by God, you masterpieces, to do what God has called you to do by being the person that you are with the God-given gifts that you have, but perhaps being wide open to that neuroplasticity at work, that you might learn some new habits which become a part of you and your leadership for the future. This is a time of great trial, but it's a time of great opportunity. I hope that's helpful. I'm back now to you, Tim.
Clive, thank you for just addressing some of the practicalities of that resilience and leadership that comes from forming habits. And I just want to encourage those listening, please do add your questions. We've only got one so far, which we'll come to in a moment. It'd be great to have some more. But I'm going to jump in, I think, by asking a question of my own, first of all. I think a number of people at the moment, locally, regionally, nationally, they're looking towards a more directive style of leadership. People are looking to the centre, whatever that centre may be. And we might say that command and control is back in fashion. So I'm just wondering whether either of you would like to sort of suggest, if that is not your natural leadership style, how do you cope with the expectation of a more directive leadership style that people are wanting?
Can I defer to someone with military as well as deep theological background here, please, Tim. Philip.
In my experience, the key thing here is to be authentic. There's a sense in which we can play a role, and that's perfectly reasonable. But the key thing is authenticity, and the resilience element is it's easier to be resilient and consistent if you are as much as possible being consistent with yourself. Although one of the key things here is the assessment of strengths and weaknesses, and the deliberate desire to perhaps strengthen those things which you identify as a weakness. One of the things that the military is particularly good at is identifying and encouraging people to go through the process of how to identify strengths and weaknesses. And we find ourselves in a very odd situation in which normal patterns we're not able to operate on our normal patterns. And so it's about an analysis of what would the new patterns be? What are the new expectations? How can I still be consistent? Because we're called to be pastors and ministers to God's people. So command and control is okay if it works within an organization that's structured for that. Our churches aren't. That's not how they're set up. And I think authenticity and an accurate understanding of our strengths and weaknesses, and then working on those to accommodate the challenges that the new circumstances present.
Okay, thank you.
I want to say, in addition to that leadership can be a very delicate subject for Baptists, because I totally embrace our congregational governance. I think I'd want to encourage us to remind ourselves and all of our members that we don't lead our churches by democracy, but theocracy. It's not saying I want this or I want that or I vote for this. It's more saying, Father, what do you want? It's ruled by God. So we exercise the mind of Christ. Now, that said, it's my experience that if people trust a leader, a woman or a man, who's given authority and set apart for that, and that they see that that person has a servant heart, then they'll recognize that there's a time where leadership is exactly what is needed and can be exercised. Jesus in John 13, assuming the absolute posture of a servant, washing the feet even of Judas, washing the disciples' feet, he says in John 13:15, recorded by John, the disciple who was deeply loved and very close to him, Jesus said, I've set you an example that you should follow. Hupodigma, a pattern, an illustration, a way of being. And I think if leadership is servant-hearted leadership, Baptists are pretty comfortable with that. There is a time for command and control, but I'd never, ever want to use that language because of the way it would be misunderstood.
Okay, so both of you are really appealing to be authentic to who we are and our gifts and skills, and don't suddenly reinvent ourselves for this season. So it's an interesting question here from Hannah Harris, just to come up. I can bring up on the screen there.
Hi, Hannah.
What would you suggest are the key, perhaps new habits to develop that will best serve us for the months and years ahead? Because as you said, Clive, although we remain authentic to our own gifts and skills, there are certain requirements on us to expand into new skills. So are there any particular ones that you think we're being called to at this moment?
I'd like to kick off with some very predictable ones, and then perhaps one that's less predictable. Hannah, thanks for a great question. Really grateful. The predictable ones, I think you'd expect me to say, that's why they're predictable, that we lean deeper into our spiritual disciplines, into our devotion to Christ, into fellowship where we can find it, even like this, that we will be reading the scriptures, we'll be reflecting, we'll be people of prayer. We will deepen those habits. Maybe we'll learn next webinar from Jane Day, a good woman of God, to be more contemplative in this time where we have the space. As an activist, Jane, I'm sure I need to listen to that one. The kind of less predictable for me and very demanding in these times, but still possible, is that we develop the habit of leading leaders, of developing other leaders, of apprenticing other leaders. The big debate over the masterpiece was it by Leonardo da Vinci or one of his apprentices? Philip has spoken to us about how we learn habits. Apprentices learn habits. He even mentioned woodwork. Well, the master woodworker, the carpenter, Jesus, has got lots to teach us. But he wants us, as Paul did with Timothy, and Timothy did with others, to pass it on. So whether by Zoom or FaceTime or Skype, etc., we can spend time with others and encourage them in their leadership. Hope that's helpful, Hannah.
Okay. Philip, do you want to add anything there?
For me, one of the this is, and I'm drawing, I must confess, on my experience, and I know that elements of my experience won't be the same as others. In a time of crisis, there is a tendency to focus on the crisis and become consumed by the crisis, to the point whereby we can find ourselves on a treadmill. And I'm not a paragon of virtue in this. I haven't had an opportunity to stop for even a cup of tea since I came to work at 10 to 8 this morning, and that's not a good practice. I think one of the new habits that we can learn, particularly at this moment, is how to honestly analyze what we're doing, what structures we have in place, what structures we need to put in place. Pastors are not particularly good at allowing themselves time and space and opportunity to actually look after themselves, as though somehow that's not being faithful. And I think the habit that I would encourage us all to incorporate when we're in unusual social settings and working patterns is to have an honest reflection of what those patterns are. What are the things that we need to put in so that we can be sustained in ourselves spiritually and physically and emotionally? And so therefore, instead of always giving out to others, we have the opportunity to be restored and refreshed ourselves. And these may well be new habits to some who are always active and busy, as opposed to taking time. And in a crisis situation, when there's an amazing amount of stress and pressure, one of the key things to endurance and resilience is having that honest reflection of what we need personally, spiritually, physically, psychologically, emotionally. These are key habits to build in that will then be enduring and lead us to have the capacity to be more resilient.
Actually, Tim, if I can chip in very briefly, there's a book that was recommended to me when I studied for my master's with Spurgeon, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Stephen Covey. And that book was an international bestseller. Actually, the chap's not a Christian, he's a Mormon, but Spurgeon's recommended it, and it was an incredibly helpful book for its content. And one of the habits he urged that we develop is sharpening the saw. There's no point, if we go back to the woodwork analogy, using a saw if it's blunt, but we need to take time out to sharpen it so we can do the job well. If Philip and I, as activists, and I think hopefully visionaries under God for change, if we don't take time to sharpen the saw, if we don't take time to reorder our habits here, maybe we won't be in it for the long haul. Thanks.
The helpful comment here from David Skeet, just that wherever our situation is, we can still strive to win the hearts and minds of people. I think that's about, again, adapting to our circumstances. So a related question here from Kenneth Brown. I wonder if you have any comments regarding self-awareness of one's default preferential leadership style and the need for adaptability, particularly in these circumstances. So maybe that's thinking about situational leadership where we adapt according to what we're facing. So again, this is about introducing change into our established patterns. Either of you want to address that?
I think the key phrase in Kenneth's very helpful observation and question is self-awareness. I think a good leader is a self-aware leader. Yeah. We all struggle with this, and I'm tempted to say, if you were to ask my senior staff or my staff, they may have an interesting few sentences on my own personal self-awareness. And so I'm not presenting myself as some kind of paragon of virtue, but I do try to be conscious and self-aware. And the other thing that's utterly invaluable in this is to have honest people who will speak honestly to you and constructively to you, so that no matter how self-aware we think we are, we often miss glaringly obvious things. And I rely upon my senior staff in particular being honest with me and helping me in my awareness of how I present and how I approach things, because ultimately the objective is to be a good leader for the benefit of people. It's that servant leadership. It's not to occupy a principal position, but it's to occupy that position of, through leadership, you serve and empower and enable others.
Can I just jump in and ask, Clive, maybe to you, how do we remain visible as leaders then? This is one of the big adaptations we are having to make. Church pastors, whoever it may be, they're no longer in front of their congregations with that ability to communicate as easily week by week. So how do we remain visible as leaders? How do we adapt in that way?
Going back to the thing I mentioned earlier, I definitely say through technology at this moment in time because of lockdown. But visibility is not just about people can see us now. They may not be blessed, but they can see us. We're visible, but visibility includes that phone call. But if it could be a FaceTime call or a Skype call, that would be better. It could even be an email. If it's safe to do so, it might be a card. It's being before the people and letting them know that you actually care. So in my role, and I know it's slightly different from local church ministry, which I've loved for many years, I'm still able to gather with teams and groups in this kind of way. So it's a question of finding new ways, developing new habits. I think we will be using this kind of technology, not least these webinars, well beyond lockdown. I think we're discovering new ways of connecting. Spurgeons will do that through their online education, I'm sure. We will do that as regional ministers, and I'm sure pastors will do this. So that's one way, if it's helpful.
Yeah, it may be that we are learning new ways to be visible, and some of those are for this season only, but some will roll on into the future that is beyond this time, however far away that may be. And I just want to encourage again, those of you who are participating, and if there are any more questions, please do post them on the stream on the right of your screen. It would be great to have a few more. We certainly have a few more minutes left. So I'm just going to jump in. Just a simple one, Philip, perhaps for you. You talked about virtue ethics and that we have to be and live in a consistent way with what we believe. Are there any particular key texts that you could point us to, any books, any resources, if somebody wants to look into that a bit further?
I would recommend Tom Wright's book, Virtue Reborn. It was published about 10 years ago, and I was struck by it when it was first published, because he articulated something that I have been thinking about in my own academic studies, about the close relationship between virtue ethics and Christian discipleship. And actually and this is something that Tom does in his book, when he looks at various gospel stories, he illustrates how in the gospel story and in the teaching of Jesus that it's utterly consistent with this principle of virtue ethics. If you boil virtue ethics down to this phrase, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence isn't an act, it's a habit. That's really the essence of the Christian discipleship of life. It is that integration of godly habits, doing good things consistently well, so that it becomes almost ingrained and second nature to us. So I would strongly recommend Tom Wright's book. It's very accessible, and it is not very expensive as well.
I think you suggested it's a 2012 publication, is that right? So it's
I think it's 2010.
2010, okay, yeah. I'm still looking to see if there are any other comments come in, and none at the moment. But Clive and Philip, I know that there are a few things that you had possibly prepared to ask each other. Maybe one of you could throw one of those in before we look at maybe another comment that's just come in.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask my friend Philip what he thinks of something that Benjamin Francis said. Benjamin Francis is a partner with BMS World Mission. He's a part of a huge disciple-making movement called Big Life. He's in India, in Calcutta. And Benjamin shared this just the other day through a mutual friend called Peter Dunn. He said, we don't decide our future, we decide our habits, and our habits decide our future. I wonder what you'd say to that, Philip, because his habits are seeing thousands of new churches planted.
I couldn't agree more. One of the only things that we carry with us through life is our character. And our character is always in a perpetual stage of formation and reformation. And there is a very simple process. Thoughts can often become actions, actions become habits, habits then become ingrained behaviours, and behaviour becomes our character. And often the character traits that we display will often give an insight into the type of future that we can expect. So if somebody has inculcated bad habits into their lives that then become devastating behavioural traits, that then become the character references that people associate, it's not surprising when some people find that if they've had bad habits and bad behaviours and so on, that they find themselves facing all kinds of challenges. I think he's absolutely right. Our habits are inextricably linked in many ways to elements of our future, not in entirety, but it can be a very significant contributing part.
Right.
Yeah. I think we're sort of aiming for around 45 minutes for these webinars, so we're approaching towards the end of that time. But here's a really key question from Hannah again. I think this is, a lot of people are asking this. Could you comment on the balance of leading in the now versus leading with a clear sight on the future? How are we wise in leveraging tomorrow's opportunities from today's challenges? I think it's a big question at the moment. How much right now should we be focusing on the future and planning for that and thinking what strategies can we use? And how much should we just be concentrating on getting on with the emergency, with the crisis, with the situation now?
I'm happy to kick off. Thanks again, Hannah. Another great question. There's some conventional wisdom going around. Psychologists and sociologists, and even those who think theologically, are saying we should be wary of trying to do too much in this time to leap into the future. That aside, I would want to say that what we can do is we can reflect about the future and seeking God, because it's God's vision for the church or the college or the association we need, not ours. We need to discern what God is saying, because without vision, it says in Proverbs, the people perish. Without revelation from God, they cast off restraint. So I think we do need to use this time to reflect. I think our churches will be different and should be different as they come through this time. And if we revert back in many cases to the same old, we'll keep getting what we've always had, and we know our churches are in decline. So thanks for the question. I think we do need to leverage tomorrow's opportunities from today's challenges.
My observation would be that I think what this crisis has done in some regards is accelerate developments that were already obvious within society. People within our churches and church communities are now learning skills that they won't unlearn, and they're, for many, learning how to access technology in a way that they wouldn't have needed to do before the crisis. And so I don't think that there will be the opportunity to unlearn what we've learned. I think there will be more of a hybrid approach in certain elements. But the key thing between the immediate and the future is, for me, to be authentic. The authentic you now is the authentic you that will go into the future. It's what will be consistent in your church family. It'll be consistent within your church community. Authenticity is key to linking together the various elements of our life, whether it's in the crisis now or in the medium term or in the future. The authentic person is authentic, and that can bring reassurance to the people that we pastor and lead.
Okay, thank you. And I see there's one further comment that's come in. I think probably we've already been addressing it, really. What do you think will be the key changes for local church and leadership after COVID-19, and how can we take them forward? I think we're already hearing that we need to be reflective and thinking, but it's too early at this point to determining what our future strategy or changes may be. But just be bearing those things in mind, thinking about them, talking them through with others, but not planning too much or getting too anxious about that.
That's right.
Well, can I very much thank both of you, Clive and Philip, for taking part, and really appreciated your input today. And I think we'll say goodbye to you now, and I'll just carry on talking for a moment. But thank you so much for being part of this and for sharing your wisdom. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And so just to wrap up, just a reminder, a recording of the webinar will be on the website a bit later, and do point people in that direction if that would be helpful. If you do want to give any feedback, however, to myself about this webinar or about the way we're doing the webinars, then we are experimenting at the moment, and we'd value that feedback. So do please email me at ministries@baptist.org.uk, and you can see the address there is on the bottom of your screen. So yeah, we'd love to know a little bit more. And a reminder again, next week we have Jane Day will be talking to us about the topic of contemplation. The nominal title, it may change, but the nominal title is there a better time to try contemplation, thinking about our devotional patterns in this time of lockdown. Just a reminder as well that tonight we have a further prayer broadcast, which again you can access through the website and the coronavirus pages that are there. And tonight's prayer broadcast at 7 p.m. is going to be led by Lynn Green and Kang Santan, the General Secretary of BMS World Mission. So I think that only leaves me to say thank you so much for joining us, and God's blessing be upon you as you continue to offer leadership to your communities right now. So goodbye from now.